If we can't feel our way into the feelings of others, then we are really kind of messed up. We have a moral failing insofar as we hide certain ugly truths from ourselves. But the very fact that we find such truths ugly is healthy. Most horrible things become acceptable the moment they become normal. And if you go through life treating all of these beings as as just objects, you're missing out on this kind of huge dimension of being human.
Hi, it's Emily from BiteSizeVegan.org. Most people are simultaneously animal lovers and animal eaters. They don't want to harm animals or see them harmed, but they also continue to eat meat, leading to what scientists have dubbed the meat paradox. Studies have found that people navigate the resulting discomfort of this cognitive dissonance with a number of coping strategies, including dissociation, detachment, and othering of non-human animals, essentially a selective severing of their empathy. In today's interview with philosopher and author John Sanbonmatsu, we explore how this societal detachment can mirror psychopathy, an argument John makes in his forthcoming book, The Omnivore's Deception: What We Get Wrong About Meat, Animals, and the Nature of Moral Life. A scholar in the interdisciplinary field of critical animal studies, John teaches ethics and philosophy at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. He is the editor of Critical Theory and Animal Liberation and the author of The Postmodern Prince. You can find his contact details in the video description and on this video's article, which also has a full transcript of our interview. John, I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Well, thanks, Emily, for having me. I'm a big fan, and I think your work is wonderful, so I'm really delighted to be here.
Psychopath and sociopath are very loaded terms. We tend to see psychopathy, especially in regards to harming animals, as a rare, aberrant, and sadistic thing. However, you suggest that on a societal level, we exhibit sociopathic and psychopathic attitudes and behaviors towards other animals. So could you explain your argument on the ubiquity of psychopathy?
So I'm using these loaded, as you said, loaded terms mostly, as you pointed out, as a kind of metaphor, but also I'd say something more than a metaphor to describe the way that we as a society and as human beings treat the other beings of the earth. We grow up in a society that acculturates us to suppress our empathetic response, right? And that naturalizes and normalizes violence and aggression against other animals. It's what happens when we see other persons as things, and that almost dissociation, a kind of inability to access the interior experiences of the other, is characteristic of antisocial personality disorders. Now, the term sociopathy and the term psychopathy are not in the DSM, the Bible of mental health diagnosis. They're not formal clinical diagnoses. So they tend to be used a little bit more informally. And without going into too many of the details about this, we can say that people with sociopathy and people with psychopathy express a kind of diminished empathetic response. And most people in society exhibit these qualities. They're selective in their empathy, right? They have empathy for this animal or this group of animals, but not these animals. And the ones that fall off the radar of their empathetic concern, right, are the ones who coincidentally are the ones that we exploit and want to keep on exploiting. So there, when I'm using psychopathy as a kind of broad, something between a metaphor and an actual description of our behavior and our psychology, right? And not everybody wants to hurt animals. And so most people don't want to see other animals harmed. And yet, at an unconscious level, we're participating in a system of violence, and we know that. If you think about the levels of extreme violence and the extensiveness of the violence, I mean, human civilization is based on the equivalent of genocide, on mass killing of literally up to 1 to 3 trillion marine animals every year, and maybe 60 billion mammals and avians and other animals, reptiles, amphibians, on land. That's every year. And that is considered, not only is it considered normal, not only is it considered ethical, it's actually seen as the best way to live a human life. And if anybody has the temerity to say, excuse me, maybe we shouldn't do this, then everyone jumps on them and makes, ridicules them, hates on them. Someone who used to eat meat, I wouldn't have thought of any of that. But the truth is, if we really get down to it, we should be disturbed by our participation, because it does show a moral callousness that is very similar to psychopathy, to what we see in psychopathy. That's kind of how I'm using these terms. And so I'm really interested in how society structures our experiences through language and power relations so that we act as though we had psychopathy. As though we were afflicted with this towards other animals.
So activists often emphasize that our unwillingness to confront the reality of what other animals experience in the animal products industries creates a fundamental barrier to understanding the true nature of our complicity as consumers. The assumption is that if consumers had to kill animals themselves, then they would stop eating animals. However, you discuss a growing do-it-yourself culture of people who do kill and butcher animals on their own, and the social perception of this being a more virtuous and authentic and honest relationship to animals and food. So would you discuss the comparative ethics of killing animals oneself versus the detached denial state that most consumers inhabit?
So there's been this meat renaissance, and it's a lot of that is around this idea of authenticity and developing a direct relationship with nature or animals. And the way to do that, a bunch of folks have said in the locavore movement, is to kill and butcher the animal yourself. As you said, there's a kind of ethos around this, such that the person who has some chickens and kills the chickens themselves, or butchers their own hog, or hunts their own meal, is engaging in a more authentic and more morally sound practice. The thing is that the ideology of meat and the ideology of human supremacy, it's just so powerful. And that's why people are able to kill animals with their own hands, because they already see them as beneath our contempt and as having lives that are worthless. Right? So these are ideas that are prevalent in society, the idea that animals just don't matter. Their lives don't matter. In my view, people who deliberately seek out opportunities to harm animals, to kill animals, to control, dominate, and kill animals, have far less moral character, than people who just unthinkingly, unwittingly buy their food at the supermarket. When we go into the supermarket and just buy a commodity without thinking about where it comes from or what went into its production, you could say, well, and I have said that there may be a kind of hypocrisy in that, right? Because we don't want to know in some cases, particularly with animal products. On the other hand, I think there's something psychically healthy about a kind of instinctual desire to avoid, not to want to see other beings being harmed. The argument of the do-it-yourself slaughterers is that that's a more morally virtuous behavior, to actually see it. You go to a slaughterhouse workshop, slaughtering workshop, butchering workshop, and you see someone else kill the animal, or you get to do it. I think it's very healthy, on the contrary, to not want to do that, to not want to see that. So it's a little psychically or psychologically complicated, because, as I say, we have a moral failing insofar as we just hide certain ugly truths from ourselves. But the very fact that we find such truths ugly is healthy.
And I think that is something that is not purposefully, but sometimes I think could potentially be perpetuated by animal activists, wherein the focus is so much on the hypocrisy and the avoidance and the denial, which are there, and it is important to recognize what's being done in our names. But as you're saying, it's also good to recognize that denial and that hypocrisy is coming from a healthy avoidance within us that is actually a huge indicator that we know that this is not an okay thing to be doing, and it's not something that we are okay with.
Absolutely. When I show my students footage of animals being harmed, everybody is upset. Everyone is very upset, and some of the students cry from that. every time I show it. And these are all meat eaters, and these are all people who, before they came into my classroom, would have just kind of laughed at it, at veganism, and made vegan jokes, and thought the whole thing was ridiculous and silly. But when they see it with their own eyes, and when they feel it with their own mammalian senses, because we are mammals and we have evolved this capacity for empathy, it changes their way of understanding the meat system and their relationship to it. Unfortunately, there are just so many forces and pressures working as disincentives to changing behavior that very few of them then become vegetarian or vegan. But every single one of them understands after seeing the stuff that it's wrong. No one ever, or almost no one in my experience, will say, well, this is okay.
Well, and I think the fact that they have that connection that I think the vast majority of people do when they see this happening, but then they don't change their behavior or their actions, that really speaks to the systemic psychopathy that you are speaking to. Yes. In relation to other animals. Like, that's where that is rearing its head in this, is not that each of us is a psychopath, but that the fact that we can watch footage like that and make that empathetic connection, but then go right back to consuming those animals, having seen that, like, because it is reinforced systemically by a societal psychopathy when it comes to how we're relating to these other animals. And it's like very powerful.
It's so much easier for us to turn the other way and not look, not see what's there. We have every incentive not to look. We have every disincentive to look. And we have every disincentive to try to get others to look. People, there's that joke about the vegan. Well, how do you know when there's a vegan in the room? Because they'll tell you. Why do vegans feel the need to tell? They want to take others and turn their heads, their gaze to this and say, see? And people don't want to see. And it's particularly damaging in a context in which it's normalized, it's seen as healthy to hurt animals, and in which people demonize and vilify anyone who tries to turn their gaze to look at the object of oppression.
I just wanted to circle back real briefly to, and the very first question where we were talking about the ubiquity of psychopathy, the societal psychopathy. I don't know if we ever really talked about that essentially being down to a separation of our empathy. And I think we're able to recognize the societal psychopathy when we're looking at cultures outside of ourselves. Americans, for sure, can look at whale hunting or dolphin hunting or killing and eating dogs, and that's where we can go, oh my gosh, this is psychopathic behavior. It's that selective application of empathy and the selectivity that we have of what we see or don't see and what we connect to or don't connect to based on what we've been conditioned into within our own societies, because we're able to see it in what other people are doing, but not in the very same things that we're doing, just to maybe a different species or these different applications.
Absolutely. And this is where, racism, speciesism, misogyny, and other ways of viewing the world can get in the way of even simply that direct apprehension of the suffering of the other, or the distress, the vulnerability of the other. Right? Empathy makes it possible for me to perceive a situation requiring moral remedy. It's a way of seeing what's there. If I don't have that empathy, that response, then I'm not going to see that there's a morally relevant situation, right, requiring remedy. And, I've seen interviews with people with psychopathy, when they're confronted with the suffering of a human. It could be a human that they're killing or a non-human animal they just happen to see drowning in their swimming pool. Nothing. They don't feel anything. If we can't feel our way into the feelings of others, then we are really kind of messed up. And so when empathy is either suppressed or absent, you have the potential for limitless violence. You have the potential for enormous harms.
So I have a video and an article where I take on the taboo topic of bestiality. And I argue that much like you have with psychopathy, bestiality is not only commonplace, even though we see it as this rare aberrant thing, but it's actually paid for and supported by the vast majority of humanity. Because when we look at the practices within the animal products industries, Many on their face are the same sexually violating acts that we would classify as bestiality. The only difference is the perceived pleasure of the human perpetrator. And that seems to be where our disgust lies as humans. And similarly, when we look at the violence against non-human animals, we're more than comfortable classifying it as psychopathic when the human takes pleasure in the infliction of harm. But we're reticent to view the systemic violence against animals as psychopathic or even as problematic. So could you speak to this distinction we make and what it is that we're actually finding objectionable if it's not the act itself?
It's a great question, and I think it's a little complex. I mean, I'm thinking back to the Nazi experience and the fact that the Nazis, in some of their internal communications, talked about killing different methods for killing Jews, and they would, in some cases, refer to, quote, more or less humane methods, right? And it was, kind of taken for granted within the SS that you weren't supposed to get off on it, that you were just doing your job and you're going to be professional about it and so forth. In fact, of course, many in the SS were very sadistic and engaged in horrific intentional cruelties. But the point I guess I'm trying to make is the apparatus, once, at the Wannsee conference, once the logistical details of the Holocaust had been arranged and the policy had been handed down for execution, all of the qualities of suffering, of just unspeakable suffering of the victims of the Nazis followed from the decision to kill. This is the thing that really bothers me about a film like Schindler's List, right, where the Nazi commandant in the film is portrayed as just like a sadistic lunatic. If only that had been the Nazi problem. But the Nazi problem, right, is that it was ordinary people. And it was ordinary people who engaged in extraordinary forms of atrocity. And so, the human character is such that it's very easy for us to be part of a bureaucracy or of a process, a normalized routine and practice that where we engage in really horrible forms of behaviors. But as you point out, because they're not intelligible within the frame of individual agency or individual affect, like if I'm getting whether I'm getting pleasure from this or not, we have a harder time seeing that systemic violence as just as bad.
I think also there's like that, what we label as sadistic and psychopathic doesn't have the sheen of being necessary, which is what we can apply to killing and eating animals, is that this concept that, but it's necessary because how else are you going to feed the world? And I think that can also provide this distinction in our minds.
Again, the curious compartmentalizing feature of our minds is that the most horrible things become acceptable the moment they become normal, taken for normal.
It's well known that most serial killers torture and kill non-human animals in their youth before moving on to humans. However, not all children who torture animals become serial killers. And you actually share a story from your own youth of how you tormented ants. So could you speak to the distinction of psychopaths versus psychopathic behavior and what this means for our ability to change our behavior in relation to other animals?
So yes, when I was a boy, I'm very sorry to say, I killed a lot of different insects. I tortured ants, killed them in the hundreds. And in reflecting on why, I don't want to get too much of my own personal psychology per se, but it really was a kind of displaced aggression. So I guess in reflecting on this part of my own personality, right, I would say that certainly my behavior towards the ants was psychopathic, and it was, I'd go further and say that it was also sadistic. I actually took an active pleasure, I'm very sorry to say, because now I don't kill any insects, but I took pleasure in harming them. So, it's disturbing to think about, but it does give me a kind of insight into the psychology, I think. But say in my case, in the case of many people, young people might engage in these kinds of behaviors, it's very clear. You can connect the dots to see how I got there, right? Through cultural influences, familial influences, my own psychological stuff, right? And the fact that now, if there's an animal trapped, a little insect or something trapped in my home, a spider or a moth or an ant, if it's a flying insect, I'll just take the insect outside, right? And so it shows that we can change, right? And that we can behave in these ways that really do resemble psychopathy, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, lack of guilt, extreme cruelty even, right? And that isn't hardwired into us, most of us. Most of us can change. It's clear, right, that there's a potential for unlearning these behaviors. A very moving example of someone who had this shift, this change in consciousness is Harold Brown. Harold Brown was brought up on a farm in Iowa, and later he became a dairy farmer himself. He felt a connection to the animals at some level, but he also butchered them or sent them to slaughter for years. Then he had a heart attack. It created a kind of hiatus. It was like a break, right, in the way he'd gone about living his life. And he began to rethink his relationship to all these animals that he had been raising for slaughter for years. And with that distance and that break, he developed a sensitivity to animal ethics and became a vegan. Well, sometime after this, he adopted a young male cow at an animal sanctuary. The cow's name was Snickers, and he had visited Snickers once or twice, I think, and then he went away for 6 months or so and then came back, and he was curious to know if Snickers would recognize him. So kind of almost like half-jokingly, I think, Harold, opened his arms and said, hello, Snickers, or hi, Snickers. And the cow immediately ran to him and put his head up against Harold's chest, gently but firmly, put his head against Harold's heart. And Harold burst into tears. And what he realized in that moment is, like, all of these years of acculturation as a boy and a man, he'd been taught, like practically every boy in every culture, to suppress his feelings, to be tough, especially in a rural working class white community. And that just kind of melted away. And from that point on, he realized, as he describes it, that he had a compassion switch, we might call an empathy switch, and that he'd been able to turn it on or off his whole life, right? So that he'd been able to have empathy for people, human people, and for certain kinds of animals, maybe his dog. But then he could turn off that switch in order to butcher animals. And when he had that epiphany, it was just mind-blowing to him. And he tells his story because what he felt in that moment with Snickers was this moment of connection, of relationality. It was just being present with this other. And that is what is so sad, tragic, is the fact that all these people like Michael Pollan or Barbara Kingsolve or all these people who are killing animals in the name of authenticity, they're missing out. They're doing something that's wrong, evil, but they're also missing out on a more spiritually elevated way of being human, which is to be in a connection with love, with others, and with all of these wonderful creatures that we live alongside of, right? And if you go through life treating all of these beings as just objects, you're missing out on this kind of huge dimension of possibility of being human and animal.
You propose, and as we saw with Harold Brown, that we aren't lost causes when it comes to reconnecting with our empathy and altering our relationship to other animals. Could you speak to how we may, as a society and individuals, make that shift?
It can't just be at the individual level. There has to be a movement that's challenging the structure of violence and the ideas that go into the making of it, challenging the meat industry's propaganda, to create an opening where people could get in touch with their empathic selves, right? So part of that is educating people about what animals are and who they are, because we see them as just these degraded, stupid, irrational beings, which they're not. And then part of it is learning to think about a new kind of civilizational order where we're glad to have other beings we're sharing the earth with, so that we stopped burning rainforests and enslaving animals and putting them in zoos and circuses. But that's the whole broader picture. But the takeaway again is that I think it's clear that we can change, and that while we may have these behaviors that are in some way like that of someone with psychopathy, we can unlearn them.
John, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I mean, these are difficult issues, but it's so great that you're creating some space for this discussion, this kind of discussion.
I hope you enjoyed hearing from John. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this complex topic in the comments. You can connect with John at johnsanbonmatsu.com and on Twitter at sanbonmatsuj, both of which are available in the description. To stay in the loop about new Bite Size Vegan content and updates, subscribe to the newsletter or follow the Telegram channel for the most reliable notifications. Just click subscribe at BiteSizeVegan.org. Now go live vegan, and I'll see you soon.